Welcome to the Cancer Research Institute's webinar series, Cancer, Immunotherapy, and You. Today's date is Tuesday, February 28th, 2017. The title for today's webinar is 5 Things Patients Need to Know When Considering a Cancer Immunotherapy Trial. Before we begin, I'd like to thank our sponsors. This webinar series is made possible with generous support from Bristol Myers Squibb and Genentech. My name is Brian Brewer, and I'm Director of Marketing and Communications at the Cancer Research Institute. The Cancer Research Institute is a nonprofit organization dedicated to saving more lives by funding research that aims to harness the immune system's power to conquer all types of cancer. Immunotherapies are now approved for a variety of cancers. We present this webinar series to patients and caregivers to help them understand what immunotherapy is, how it's different from other cancer treatments, what the latest developments in research and treatment are, and how to connect to immunotherapy clinical trials. Now it's my pleasure to welcome today's expert speaker. Dr. Leena Gandhi is the Director of Thoracic Medical Oncology at New York University's Langone Medical Center and an Associate Professor of Medicine at NYU's Laura and Isaac Perlmutter Cancer Center. She's also a member of the Cancer Research Institute and Ludwig Cancer Research Clinical Trials Network. Dr. Gandhi's work focuses largely on treating lung cancer patients with a promising type of immunotherapy called checkpoint inhibitors. Her work as a lead investigator on a pivotal phase 1 clinical trial has helped to demonstrate the usefulness of a specific biomarker to predict patient responses in patients treated with immunotherapy. Her ongoing research involves evaluating the impact of other therapies such as chemotherapy, targeted therapy, and radiation therapy on the tumor microenvironment to better understand how to optimize patient responses to treatment. Dr. Gandhi, we are grateful that you could take time out of your day to join us, and welcome.
Thank you.
So I wanted to jump right in with some questions. I guess, the title for today's webinar is 5 Things that Patients Should Know When Considering an Immunotherapy Clinical Trial. So let's start with the most basic question. What is a clinical trial, and what role do they play in improving personalized cancer treatment?
That's a very important question, and I would answer that in 2 different ways. The technical answer is that a clinical trial is an evaluation of a new therapy or a new combination of therapies to see if that might be a useful and helpful approach to treating cancer. I think the more honestly real answer is that a trial is really any therapy that's given for cancer. Because cancer is unique in every individual, pretty much any therapy that you receive as a cancer patient is in some sense a trial to see if it actually helps you and benefits you in controlling the cancer. And that's measured usually by radiographs, by CT scans or other kinds of scans to see if we're actually controlling the cancer. And that happens on and off an actual clinical trial. Either way, it's in some sense a trial.
So, clinical trials happen in different phases. Can you walk us through what those phases are, and can you especially put into context for patients and caregivers considerations that they would need to have when looking at potentially enrolling in a clinical trial?
Yes, definitely. So there are traditional definitions of clinical trials, and there are evolving definitions of clinical trials. But I would say the traditional definitions of clinical trials are that there are really 3 phases or 4 phases of clinical trials. Many people think, I think when they hear the word clinical trial, of a phase 3 clinical trial. And that's when you compare drug X against drug Y and ask which one is better. And those are often the kinds of clinical trials that are being done in the setting of evaluating antihypertensive drugs. Which one is drug X better than drug Y, or is drug X better than a placebo? I would say those are less commonly the types of trials that we're doing in the world of cancer, mostly because we're really often trying to evaluate brand new therapies and whether they work at all, and at what dose or what level they should be even tested at. So we are much more frequently, especially in the world of lung cancer, but overall in cancer, operating on the earlier phase of the spectrum of those trials. So phase 1 trials, which is the opposite end of the spectrum, is really taking a brand new drug or a new combination of drugs, and asking what is the safe and tolerable dose of this drug that should be then tested further in a specific setting. So the questions asked in a phase 1 trial are really about safety. And if it's a combination of drugs, it's what is the right dose to combine with another drug so that they're safe together and they're effective together. While phase 1 trials are often thought of as the most experimental and maybe from a patient's point of view, maybe the least desirable, I think quite the opposite is true, actually. Often they're the most desirable because they're really giving access to new therapies that we're very hopeful will make a bigger difference than the therapies we have existing in the clinic. Phase 2 trials are somewhere in between, and that's also an evolving definition. It often is testing a drug that has been found to have a dose that's safe in a phase 1 trial, and then testing in a specific setting. So, for instance, if you test drug X and you know the dose of drug X is safe, you test it in all patients with lung cancer, or maybe even a more specific setting, such as all patients with lung cancer who have high PD-L1 expression, or who have some other unique characteristic, so we can really test how well the drug is likely to work for a group of benefits that is designed to work against. And that's really, I think, the difference in clinical trials nowadays, is that they're really, the definitions are evolving, because we know that what we'd like to do in all of cancer care is personalized therapy and really make sure that we give the right patient the right drug that has the best chance of being beneficial for that individual. And that often means using characteristics about the cancer, molecular determinants, so genetic changes in the cancer, or unique aspects about the immune microenvironment of the cancer to figure out what is the best type of drug to give that patient. And I'll give you an example. In lung cancer, there's a subtype of lung cancer called EGFR mutant lung cancer, for which, at least right now, certain kinds of PD-1 inhibitors or checkpoint inhibitors that are a type of immunotherapy have not been that effective. And for them, there are very, very effective targeted therapies that work directly against the abnormal EGFR protein. So we usually start there. But it also means that when we think about clinical trials, because we hope that immunotherapies may be useful for everybody because they seem to be more durable than targeted therapies or chemotherapies, we try to think specifically about those patients, that maybe those are patients that would do better on a combination trial where you're combining a PD-1 inhibitor with something else to try to boost the effect of it, because for those patients, a PD-1 inhibitor alone might not be enough. So again, this phase 2 trial setting might be really a very specific setting of testing a combination of immunotherapy drugs for patients with EGFR mutant lung cancer to really kind of hone in on how are we going to best use these drugs in the clinic, in the real world.
That's an excellent segue into the next question, which is, and something that patients need to consider when looking at, often when they go to search for clinical trials on a website or on the Cancer Research Institute website, for instance, they can come back with a list of 20, 30 trials, but of course patients aren't necessarily eligible for every one of those trials. So I know that eligibility requirements vary from trial to trial, but can you give us a sense of kind of what are some of the more common types of eligibility criteria?
Yeah, so eligibility criteria, you're right, are often very strict and very rigid. And they're that way for a reason, which is that a clinical trial is really an experiment to try to make sure that we can prove whether a therapy is safe or beneficial or more effective than another drug, depending on the phase of the trial. And so for that reason, we try to make sure that the patients in the trial have certain criteria that will meet two different standards. One, that they're going to be a relatively uniform population so that we know that there aren't other variables that are accounting for the benefit or lack of benefit in those patients. And two, that they actually have particular criteria that would make this a safe type of therapy for them to participate in. And that's probably the most critical factor. When you're testing a new drug and you don't know all of the side effects, you really want to make sure that you're not going to cause harm. That is certainly our number one goal in medicine, is that we don't want to do that. And we want to make sure that people are going to be safe. So for instance, if we know that a drug is likely to have effects on the liver, if it's metabolized in the liver, then we would make one of the eligibility criteria that you must have normal liver function, because we wouldn't want to cause risk to causing more problems with your liver if you have existing liver disease. For immunotherapies, there are often very common criteria that are used to make sure that we're testing these in a safe setting. So usually patients with autoimmune disease or susceptibility to really inflammatory conditions are excluded, because we don't want to risk turning that inflammatory condition into something life-threatening when we're dealing with new or unknown drugs. After clinical trials are finished and we know a lot more about the safety profile, there is often a kind of backtracking and reevaluation of those drugs in people who might have some of those kind of questionable eligibility criteria that wouldn't have allowed them onto a trial. But in the real world, we do want to know whether we can be beneficial with these drugs for everybody. So I'm sorry I didn't mention earlier, but phase 4 trials is a term that's kind of a pseudo medical term, because it's not really a technical thing, but really it generally means clinical trials or evaluations of drugs done in the post-approval setting to get more information about the use of drugs in the real world in patients who might not have been otherwise eligible or meet these very strict and narrow criteria to participate in a clinical trial. But it's very true that it can be confusing when you look at clinical trials on any kind of website as to whether you're really likely to be eligible or not. And often the eligibility criteria listed on websites are a subset of truly what's involved and required. So I would say in those circumstances, it is really, really helpful to be guided by a physician as to what trial is right for an individual patient, what makes the most sense in terms of not only the eligibility criteria, but what's actually involved. Some of the other key components to being a participant in a clinical trial are logistics, honestly, and that's a very key part of a clinical trial, because the earlier the phase of the trial, the more there is involved. And what I mean by that is that when we're really evaluating safety, there's a lot of monitoring that happens on a clinical trial. That means often more frequent visits than you might have during standard care. It often means more testing than you might have during standard care. Specifically, there might be a lot of extra blood tests where we monitor how the drug is metabolized or cleared out of the body, so that we know how to best dose it in a safe manner. There also can be other kinds of evaluations, for instance, biopsies or sampling to try to understand how the drugs are working. That's particularly critical in evaluating immunotherapies. Immunotherapies are often drugs that we can't fully understand in model systems, in the cells in a dish or in animal models, because they don't have the same kind of immune system that a human being does. So often we really have to evaluate how they're working by taking samples from patients being treated with these therapies on clinical trials.
One of the eligibility criteria that I've seen in the past involves whether or not someone has received treatment with either another type of immunotherapy or a chemotherapy. I guess we don't really need to get into why that is, but on a more basic level, if I'm a patient and I've enrolled in a clinical trial, or I've been treated with an FDA-approved immunotherapy and failed, am I automatically ineligible to look for other immunotherapy trials?
Not at all. In fact, that's a very active area of research, is how can we overcome resistance to initial immunotherapies. So the immunotherapies that are approved in lung cancer, for example, or also in all other tumor types now, are primarily PD-1 inhibitors and CTLA-4 inhibitors, and sometimes people use a combination of those two. But we really don't know a lot about why people occasionally develop resistance over time to those therapies. So that's a really active area of research, is to try to understand, well, what happens, and can we give a new combination of drugs that might overcome that resistance? So that's really probably the most common type of immunotherapy trial out there right now, are combinations of PD-1 inhibitors with something else. And they're often being tested in both people who have never been exposed to immunotherapy, and sometimes that term is called immunotherapy naive, and people who have been previously exposed to immunotherapy, to understand if maybe if we add another drug, whether we can overcome the resistance. So one example of that is that there actually have been some studies in lung cancer patients suggesting that when people are treated with a PD-1 inhibitor and develop resistance, that sometimes another protein in the microenvironment around the tumor gets upregulated or starts to be overexpressed. There's more of it. And that protein called TIM3 is also a regulator of immune responses, and there are drugs being developed that target TIM3. So it might be that when you combine a drug against TIM3 with a PD-1 inhibitor, that you can overcome that mechanism of resistance and maybe make that patient benefit again from the PD-1 inhibitor.
You've mentioned combinations a lot, and so that this is a very intense area of interest and potential in terms of benefiting patients. Are there sort of a sub question here of how clinical trials are structured, but are there differences in terms of what patients should expect to experience when they're receiving more than one drug at a time than if they were just receiving one drug?
Well, yes, it's a good question, and it's a little bit of an unknown right now. We do worry that when you add on drugs that can modulate or affect the immune system, that you might add to the risk of toxicities. And we know that is the case, at least for one example of combination immunotherapy that's already approved in melanoma and has been tested, probably the most extensively tested combination in lung cancer. It's a combination of a PD-1 inhibitor called nivolumab with a CTLA-4 inhibitor called ipilimumab. And those are two different targets on immune cells that modulate whether T cells become active and can kill things around them, kill abnormal cells, hopefully tumor cells. But both of them are normally regulating your immune response and controlling your immune response, so that when you block both of those signals, you actually can have a higher risk of having inflammatory side effects or autoimmune side effects. And these were actually first characterized with ipilimumab, which has been approved as probably the longest immunotherapy approved in the setting of use in cancer, and of the newer generation of drugs.
And that's only 6 years ago. So I mean, we're still talking about
right.
very
But when
recent.
that drug was approved, it actually came with a black box warning from the FDA, which means that we really have to take caution when giving patients this drug, that we're really going to make sure that we have a higher chance of benefit than risk for patients because there were such severe side effects seen. And when these drugs were first tested together, we did see an increase in side effects. And in melanoma, I believe the percentage of serious side effects that was seen was actually about 58%, which is really high. That means more than half of people are going to experience a potentially serious side effect from the combination of drugs. In lung cancer, actually, this is a really good example of where clinical trials have helped. When the drugs were first tested together in lung cancer, they were tested at the same doses they're used in melanoma. And we, again, saw quite high side effects that limited the dosing, and we weren't really seeing a lot of better efficacy, that they weren't that much more effective. But it was limited because patients were honestly having severe side effects on the drugs. So the trials actually went back and started testing different combinations and different dosing schedules of the drug. So specifically actually reducing the amount of ipilimumab, both in dose and also how frequently it was given. And by doing that, we learned that we could more safely combine them and get a lower rate of serious side effects, so that it approximates the same kind of risk that if you were giving the PD-1 inhibitor nivolumab alone, and still get improved efficacy. So this is still an early trial. It's a phase 1 trial, but was recently published and suggested that there might be up to double the response rate with the combination without a lot of extra toxicities when you give them in a certain way. Not the same doses that were in melanoma, but went back and adjusted the doses so that it was maybe safer and more tolerable.
So that just speaks to the potential for complexities in terms of the different variations in trials you can have, and why there's been such an explosion in the number of clinical trials of immunotherapy, especially combination immunotherapies. And you're testing it on different patient segments. You're testing it in different dosage and timing. A lot of different variables to consider.
That's absolutely true. And for that reason, because there's so many new drugs in development, what's interesting about immunology is we've known a lot about different players that control immune responses, but we haven't known a lot about their potential in cancer. And now that we've had some success with PD-1 inhibitors, we're really going back to our basic knowledge of immunology and trying to combine many, many different factors, many drugs targeting different players in the immune microenvironment to see if that will help improve the overall response or extend that benefit to other patients. But by doing so, it's hard to know really which combination is going to ultimately be successful. So one of the things that has changed about the structure of clinical trials is that there are many more umbrella protocols, they're sometimes called, or skeleton protocols, which really involves sort of a backbone of your
Skeleton sounds
standard.
scary.
Well, meaning that you can basically build in lots of different combinations into the same trial. Getting a trial off the ground honestly takes years to write the trial, go through the regulatory processes of approval, and then to get it started, and then to conduct the trial can take 5 years. So to try to condense that process and make sure that we make more rapid advances, we try to do these umbrella is probably a better word, protocols, where we sort of combine a backbone of what we know is effective, the PD-1 inhibitor, and combine it with lots of different things. So combine it with drug X, drug Y, drug Z in different sort of cohorts of the same study, so you can simultaneously evaluate maybe the potential for different combinations. You often are going to have the same eligibility criteria, are often going to have the same safety concerns about inflammatory conditions, and so they can be all structured within the same clinical trial and hopefully get an answer faster.
So go ahead, sorry.
No, I was just going to say one other thing about safety I was going to say is that, I can't overestimate the importance of safety, particularly in immunotherapy trials. Not only was there this black box warning with the first immunotherapy that was approved, but for lung cancer patients in particular, one of the inflammatory side effects is something called pneumonitis, or inflammation that happens within the lungs. But that's also where patients often have a lot of the cancer. And many patients with lung cancer sometimes have underlying lung disease as well. So they can get very, very sick very quickly from having some kind of inflammation on top of the existing cancer. And I will tell you that I was involved in many of the initial phase 1 trials of PD-1 inhibitors, and I saw patients that had really serious side effects, and there were patient deaths. And initially, when we were first trying these drugs, a lot of us were really scared about using them at all, and didn't even want to participate in the trials, didn't want to enroll our patients on the trials. But because we learned a lot in the beginning about how to recognize these because of these rigid monitoring aspects of the trials, we were able to start to recognize them earlier. And when we recognize them earlier, we can actually get on top of them, treat them with high-dose steroids, and often control them. So now, even though we're using all of these drugs much, much more broadly, it's very, very rare that we see patients get serious side effects that would actually cause permanent harm, because we're able to get on top of them more quickly, because we've built in the parameters to understand how to use them safely.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's been a lot of media attention recently about some deaths from clinical trials of different types of course, there are many different types of immunotherapies, and even in those different types, there's different subtypes. So not every immunotherapy is equal, but certainly the question about safety and risk is top of mind for patients and caregivers as they make their treatment decisions. I think I know how you're going to answer this question, but I think it bears repeating. So with so many variations available, so many options, what's the best way for a patient to make a decision about which trial to enroll in?
Yeah, that's a good question and hard to answer. And I'll be quite honest, this may not be the answer that people want to hear. It would be nice to say that we can scientifically assign the right person to the right trial, but that suggests that we already know the answer the trial is trying to find out. And unfortunately, we're still in the question asking phase. So I would say a lot of the answer honestly depends on what is the right trial at the right time for an individual patient. So working with your doctor is really, really critical to deciding that answer, because I think a lot of the answer actually does come down to logistics. There are many, many options with good potential out there at this point in time, which is a unique and great place to be for cancer patients and people who take care of patients with cancer. And because of that, I think that a lot of the answer is sort of, well, what is a trial that's available to me that I meet the eligibility criteria for, that I'm going to be able to manage and go along with all that's required of the trial, and that it's going to interfere the least with my quality of life. Because at the end of the day, quality of life is actually the goal of a lot of most of the cancer treatments that we use. It really is about quality of life, about improving and maintaining quality of life for as long as possible. So if we're worsening your quality of life with the treatment, then we aren't achieving any goals through that. If we're able to maintain or improve that, then that's something you might want to actually participate in, both for your benefit and maybe for others as well.
So you talked about logistics as a key factor. So can the patient get to the trial site on the dates at the frequency that's required? Can the patient stay on the trial for as long as is required? Can you give a sense of, we're going past 5 things now. We've kind of branched into 8 or 9 things people need to know about cancer immunotherapy trials, but I think that's great. How long is there an average amount of time, a length of time that a patient is expected to continue going back to the hospital or the clinic to give blood samples, to undergo scans? What's the timetable on that on average?
Yeah, I mean that is a good question, and so that I will answer that in 2 parts. So one is about the treatment itself. I mean, treatments of any type for cancer are usually not time limited, meaning we usually, particularly in the setting of metastatic cancer, where we're trying to really control the cancer long term, if a treatment is effective, we tend to keep using it as long as it is effective and tolerable, to really keep the cancer under control. And that varies a little bit with immunotherapies. Sometimes they have time limits, but it's often long, it's 1 or 2 years. But in terms of the assessments and what's actually required, in terms of the visits and the frequency of blood sampling or biopsies or whatever, that intensity is usually for most trials, mostly upfront, meaning that usually we're trying to measure the pharmacokinetics, which is how we measure from blood sampling how the drugs are cleared through your body in the first 1 or 2 cycles. So I would say in the first 1 or 2 months is what that often translates into. There can be much more intensity to the schedule of visits and testing that's done that usually levels off after that first 2 months and often gets very infrequent. At that point, the time limiting thing is really the frequency of the treatment. If it's given once every few weeks or if it's given once a week, that would be the kind of, the thing that controls how often you have to come in. But the really intense part of a trial is mostly in the very beginning. So if that's a doable situation for people, then I think it's definitely worth considering.
So it was reassuring to me to hear that I guess in most cases, if a drug is working on a patient, they're not going to be dropped from the trial. Yes, okay, great, we've seen that it works, bye-bye. It's more like you'll continue to receive this.
Yeah, and it's a tricky line to balance. The goal of a clinical trial is a research question, and so it's often drilled into us as investigators when we train and learn how to conduct clinical trials that we are trying to answer a research question, and that patients are not patients on a clinical trial, they are participants in a clinical trial. And while that is absolutely true, the reality is that these are cancer patients that are participating in clinical trials. And even though they may do so with the noblest of intentions, the fact of the matter is that we would not ask patients to think about participating in a clinical trial if there were not at least some potential for benefit for themselves. So while we cannot say, because these are still untested drugs for the most part, or still early in testing, that these are known to be beneficial, we can say that these research drugs can have the potential for benefit. So if there is that potential for benefit, we obviously don't want to at any point in time deny the benefit of that to a patient who's actually getting benefit. And so I would say for most clinical trials, there are exceptions, but for most therapeutic clinical trials in the setting of cancer, if somebody is benefiting from the trial, there's usually a way for them to continue that drug for as long as they're benefiting.
That's great. So that's all the questions. I think, as I said, we've gone over 5 things, and we'll summarize these and provide a slide deck for folks who are curious about downloading that after this webinar. Are there any additional thoughts that you'd like to offer, Dr. Gandhi, for patients interested in clinical trials?
I don't think so. I guess the one thing I would just say is that I think it really can be a very confusing and daunting world to navigate on your own. Doing internet research, because there's so many variables, and even your own doctor may not be able to tell you the details of whether you're the right candidate for a particular clinical trial unless your doctor is an investigator or taking part in that clinical trial. But I would encourage you to use your doctor as a partner to navigate and figure out where or when is the right time for and place for a clinical trial. So if you're not at a place where there are a lot of clinical trials, your doctor can often help you navigate where is a center that might offer a lot of clinical trials that would be feasible for you to think about if that were something that made sense for you. And they may also be able to navigate and help you understand whether this is something worth exploring or worth going out of your way to explore or not.
All right. Well, thanks very much for that. I'd like to wrap up today's wonderful webinar by once again thanking our very generous sponsors, Bristol Myers Squibb and Genentech. You can learn more about cancer immunotherapy treatment for many different types of cancer at theanswertocancer.org, the Cancer Research Institute's portal for patients and caregivers. You can learn about immunotherapy and clinical trials. You can also hear directly the stories of patients who've enrolled in and participated in clinical trials. And of course, there is a clinical trial finder available there that can help connect you to one of the trials for which you or a loved one may be eligible. I'd like to also invite you to view this and other past webinars that we've produced over the years, which provide updated or current information about immunotherapy breakthroughs for a variety of cancers. And that address is cancerresearch.org/webinars. Thanks again, Dr. Gandhi. It's wonderful to get a little bit of your time today, and we look forward to speaking with you again in the future. And thanks all to those of you who are watching this webinar. Goodbye.